Space is often said to be the final frontier. The human mind can't even comprehend the vast expanse of the universe. To this day, humans have only traveled to the moon and back. However, back in 1960, no human had ever been in space. There were two countries who wanted to accomplish this first, the United States and the Soviet Union. The space race was a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union to establish global dominance by exploring space before the other. This event, as part of the Cold War, eventually led to a compromise in which both nations decided to work together to further explore space. Following World War II, and continuing for the next 40 years, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a conflict known as the Cold War that pitted the democracy of the United States against the communism of the Soviet Union in an age of constant nuclear threats. These two rivals both wanted to prove their global dominance and show off their advancements to the world. One way they would do this is by getting a man on the moon. Both of these nations wanted to prove technological and scientific advancements by traveling to space starting in the 1950s. This competition would be known as the space race. In October of 1957, the Soviets struck first when they launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. The launching of Sputnik 1 increased the conflict of the space race as it spread concern throughout the United States about their Cold War rivals' scientific capabilities and their potential capacity to launch nuclear weapons.
The fact that the Soviets were the ones to put Sputnik into space in 1957 made it so imperative that the United States regain the technological kind of leadership, and that was measured by whether they could take the next step.
In 1958, the United States took the next step by launching their first artificial satellite, Explorer 1. Later that year, the USA formed the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. This new space agency was made to speed up the aerospace technology advancements for the US to compete with their Soviet counterparts. The space race had officially begun. To strengthen their position in this conflict, the United States wanted to improve their math, science, and technology programs for students. In the National Defense Education Act of 1958, funding from the government was increased in many schools in order for students to excel in these subjects and later benefit the country by helping with the space exploration movement. This act was fairly successful, as was evidenced in a letter to President Kennedy from Mary Lou Retler, an 8th grade student from Michigan. In her letter, Mary noted that,
"At school, they tell us that we study science so that we can make our world a better place to live in,"
showing that these new science programs caused students like Mary to think deeper about subjects like science and space. As the conflict of the space race raged on, the next goal for the Soviets and Americans was to get a man into space. Once again, the Soviet Union beat the US in this endeavor, and sent Yuri Gagarin into space on April 12, 1961. Yuri Gagarin completed a 108-minute orbit of the Earth before returning safely. President John F. Kennedy sent a telegram to Nikita Khrushchev congratulating the Soviets on getting a man into space, stating that,
"It is my sincere desire that in the continuing quest for knowledge of outer space, our nations can work together to obtain the greatest benefit to mankind."
Despite Kennedy congratulating Khrushchev and offering a note of compromise, this event only intensified Kennedy's desire to win the space race and guided his actions to deal with this conflict during his presidency. The conflict of the space race was heating up. Less than a month later, the United States managed to also get a man into space, when Alan Shepard went up and down on a 15-minute trip. 1 year later, in 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth.
John Glenn on Friendship 7 orbited the Earth, and that was a source of great pride for the nation at the time.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson wrote to JFK about the progress the space program had made. In the memo, Johnson reported that,
"If we do not make the strong effort now, the time will soon be reached when the margin of control over space and over men's minds through space accomplishments will have swung so far on the Russian side that we will not be able to catch up, let alone assume leadership."
This was all Kennedy needed to hear in order to launch the most aggressive space initiative the US had ever seen to push the conflict with the Soviet Union forward. In a 1962 speech at Rice University, President Kennedy encapsulated the conflict that existed and reinvigorated America's spirit and interest in space.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
He put America on notice that they were to achieve this goal within a decade, and it was setting the goal that was so crucial to the success of the space program.
The feats and new records in this conflict continued as both the Soviets and Americans rushed towards reaching the moon. After John Glenn, the next main accomplishment was the Soviet Union sending the first woman to space, Valentina Tereshkova, in 1963. Aside from the main conflict, both countries faced many other problems involving technologies needed in order to continue exploring space.
The biggest problem with the space race was safety and reliability of the launches. Both the US and Russia used the Germans' knowledge of rockets to build their initial rockets, but safety and reliability were paramount and hard to achieve in the beginning.
As the 60s went by, more and more technology came into play and the space race intensified. In March of 1965, the USSR once again surpassed the US as Alexei Leonov aboard the Voskhod 2 became the first person to get out of a spacecraft and walk in space. In 1968, however, America gained an upper hand in this conflict. On December 21st, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders were launched into space aboard Apollo 8. The Apollo 8 mission was the first mission to successfully orbit the moon. As the end of the decade neared, both countries were hastily trying to develop technology that would get astronauts on the moon. On July 16, 1969, the space conflict would come to an end as Apollo 11 and its crew became the first to land on the surface of the moon. America had won the space race and had accomplished Kennedy's goal of putting a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon, with Buzz Aldrin following after. As Armstrong once said,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
Not only had the US won the space race, but they had taken a giant step toward bringing the Cold War to an end. America's ability to put a man on the moon showed the world the superiority of democracy.
The space program was crucial to our ability as a nation to demonstrate to the world that a free market democracy could apply all of the best that people could bring and achieve extraordinary things.
Fast forward 21 years, and the Soviet Union was falling apart after the Berlin Wall was torn down. The Soviet Union's days were over, and communism was out of Eastern Europe. With the Cold War over, space exploration became one area where the United States and Russia could now compromise. Despite the differences between these two nations in world affairs, they have been able to compromise, work together, and combine resources for the sake of the exploration of space.
Well, it's so ironic that the space program was really driven by competitive desire to beat the Russians. And yet it's evolved so much so that right now we rely on the Russians to get to the International Space Station. They're the ones that provide the rockets today. And of course, like all of our other collaborators, they are sharing in the cost of maintaining the International Space Station.
In fact, the US and Russia agreed to collaborate to build the first ever lunar space station on September 27, 2017. It is all part of NASA's plan to reach further out in the solar system called the Deep Space Gateway. NASA will without doubt continue to expand, and the human race will continue to venture further into the depths of space. There are many more advancements to come and discoveries to be made. All of the progress we have made in the field of space exploration leads back to one thing: the space race. The conflicts of the space race are the key to future compromises in space exploration.